Today we are going to discuss Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Our topic of discussion today will be the title of Great Expectations. Now, before we move on to discussing the text, let us just look very briefly at the story of Great Expectation. When the novel opens, Pip is around 80 years old. He is somebody who is an orphan, standing by the swamp. He has lost his parents. His siblings are dead. We learn a little later that he's being brought up by hand, literally, by an elder sister. His only solace is, of course, Joe, his brother-in-law. And Pip is somebody who suddenly, comes to have a different view of life because of a certain visit that he gets to pay at the Miss Havisham's. It is from here that he sort of nurtures the dream of becoming a gentleman one day so that he would be able to marry the beautiful Estella. So the very idea of Great Expectation grows from the tale of Pip. It's a Bildungsroman novel, which means, we see the journey of Pip from a young child as he becomes an adult. Now, when we talk about Dickens, people have said that Dickens was not really what you would call a gentleman. I would like to quote here, when people say that Dickens could not describe a gentleman, what they mean is that Dickens could not describe a gentleman as gentlemen feel a gentleman. They mean that he could not take that atmosphere easily, accept it as normal atmosphere, or describes the world from the inside. Dickens did not describe gentlemen in the way gentlemen describe gentlemen. He described them from the outside as he describes any other oddity or special trait. This is what J.K. Chesterton had to say. It was believed that Dickens could not describe a gentleman because he was not one himself. In 1871, Foster's The Life of Charles Dickens reported the imprisonment of Dickens's father on charges of debt, non-payment, and his own childhood employee status in the blacking factory. This revelation only gave confirmation to Dickens's detractors that he was not the conventional gentleman. He was too mixed to be a gentleman. That is what his daughter had to say about him. His daughter, Kate Dickinson. When Dickens was writing, his contemporary happened to be none other than William Thackeray. Both Dickens and Thackeray were novelists of the middle-class emergence, but they were at the opposite side of the scale. Thackeray's idea was the land between the aristocracy and the middle classes, while Dickens was concerned with the lower reaches of the middle class in its most anxious phase of self-definition, struggling out of trade and domestic service. Dickens found and mastered a fictional form capable of expressing the social ironies underlying, both in his own and his generation, preoccupation with the idea of a gentleman, and in doing so delivered what in many ways his most profound commentary on Victorian civilization and its values. That is what we could say he delivered. Also, Dickens could write Great Expectation because he was deeply involved in the process of social evolution. Dickens came of age after the 1832 Reform Bill. The bill attempted to give more clarity and equal representation to the suffrage character of England at that time. Dickens also shared the age's fascination with the idea of a gentleman. It is thus obvious and clear as to why he was pulled in many directions by the conflicting images of gentlemanliness in the early Victorian age. Dickens, who saw gentlemen from the outside, came to appreciate both the centrality of the gentlemanly idea in Victorian culture and the underlying irony that, however moralized, the concept dependent for its existence upon exclusion on separating the gentleman from the non-gentleman. Great Expectation is the fruit of that understanding. Great Expectation, like the other novels of Dickens, Hard Times, was written on the prompting of urgent external circumstances. In October 1860, Dickens wrote to Foster, his editor, of many serialized writing, but later went on to become his friend. I quote him, "It was perfectly clear that one thing to be done was for me to strike in. I have therefore decided to begin a story. The length of, let's say, Tale of Two Cities. On the 1st of December, dashing in, I come in when most wanted." Unquote. Dickens was referring to the financial crunch that was being faced by All the Year Round, 1859, the magazine that had also published his Tale of Two Cities. This gesture of Dickens was not exclusive everything. He had done so with Household Words by publishing Hard Times in it when the magazine was in a similar financial crisis. Great Expectations was Dickens's 13th novel, was published in the weekly journal All the Year Round finally. An American edition was also published, curiously, a week advance of the English version in Harper's Weekly. It is another of the novel of Dickens that contains a strong autobiographical element, though not as openly as David Copperfield. Dickens reread Copperfield before beginning Great Expectation to avoid unintentional repetition. It has been called Dickens's darkest work by some. It was very well received by Victorian readers and remains one of Dickens's most popular works till date. Many consider this novel Dickens's greatest use of plot, characterization, style, and hence his masterpiece. The novel in itself is a reflection of its time and life. There are many examples in the novel that can prove this. I quote, "I don't know why it should be crack things to be a brewer, but it is indisputable that while you cannot possibly be genteel and bake, you may be as genteel as never was and brew, you see it every day." Unquote. "Yet a gentleman may not keep a public house. May I, said I, not on any account, returned Herbert, but a public house may keep a gentleman." Unquote. This is a passage from Great Expectation, chapter 22. Such witty registration of social reality leaves the theorist of manners far behind. And this, incidentally, is a reflection of the times when the novel of our discussion was being written. Nonetheless, the very frequency with which the question, "What is it to be a gentleman? Who is a gentleman?" was being asked in the 1850s and the 60s is a fact which becomes an important aspect to understand the novels, as it testifies of a growing uncertainty about the old trademarks of gentlehood, which the fiction itself attempts to reflect and bring us to think about. The problem of the self-made man or would-be gentleman can be found to be a subject of many novels of the time. Mrs. Crack's John Halifax, Gentleman, that was written in 1856, Meredith's Ivan Harrington, or He Would Be a Gentleman, 1861, Trollope's Dr. Throne, 1858, contains a vulgar, self-made man as well as an illegitimate heroine who puzzles over her humble birth. So, you could see that there are many features of the contemporary thought process of gentlemen that is to be found in the novel. One reason why I'm stressing on the concept of a gentleman, because Pip's expectation is to be a gentleman. So therefore the question that always remains in our mind, does he become a gentleman? If he becomes a gentleman, What kind of a gentleman does he become? Does he become a gentleman as the society approves of? Or does he develop into a gentleman, a version that Dickens supports? As we see the novel, initially, of course, Pip only becomes a gentleman in terms of manners, in terms of clothes, in terms of his behavior. We have seen earlier when he was actually given the proposal of coming to London, he of course thinks that his benefactor is Miss Havisham, and when Biddy says that he should not be too quick to respond to this offer, he accuses her of being jealous of his progress. Later, in London, there comes a point when he is ill. Joe, who has always been fond of him, had, of course, made it a point to come to London and see that he was actually looked after. After he had recovered, Pip was actually very, he was very uncomfortable with Joe's presence. Later, when Magwitch, his real benefactor, turns up, and Pip realizes that he had a convict past, Pip is very hesitant once again. He begins to think that, what is going to happen if people come to know that he has such an association. It is only much later, when Pip begins to have a change of heart, that he begins to call Magwitch Uncle Provis. This word, Uncle Provis, he had begun to call him out of necessity, but later it becomes a word of affection. Later we do see Pip makes every attempt to try and save Magwitch. It is then that he becomes a gentleman. He does return once again to his native land, not only to thank Joe, but with the intention of marrying Biddy. But Biddy by this time is already happily married to Joe. That, we understand, is another line of thought. Coming back to this age that we are seeing this novel being written, it was the age of rivalry, money worship, spurious equality. We all seek to be gentlemen and gentlewomen. The pursuit is laudable. The aim is noble. What is more, you run a race. You may be all winners, for each one has a goal, or has at least a goal point. As a gentleman, then of course, Dickens thought a gentleman ought to be a person who should be self-made, who should have concern and sympathy for others. This is something that Dickens makes it clear from the very beginning. Young Pip, who helps the convict by getting him food, is actually a boy who is innocent and good at heart. We can't deny that. And it is this goodness, I think, that allows us to hear the tale of Pip and makes us expect that one day Pip will become a real gentleman. Incidentally, Dickens did use known incidents in newspapers in his writings, and in Great Expectations was known also to use some. In February 1861, inmates at the Chatham convict prison, dissatisfied with their treatment, erupted in a bloody riot. In the installment of the novel that appeared on 13th April 1861, in All Round Year, Pip the narrator, with whom Dickens shared his aversion to the mollycoddling of the jailbirds, described his visit to Newgate Prison with Wemmick in chapter 32 of the novel as appalling. This approach, where newspaper events molded the course of the novel, is not an exclusive hallmark of Dickens, but a number of other Victorian novelists also followed this kind of journalistic pattern of writing. Again, it is not that Dickens always found appreciation for such an approach. A reviewer in Rambler, 1862, complained of Dickens's writing style. I quote, it is the mere poverty of an imagination, self-restrained to one narrow field of human nature, that makes him search curiously for such follies and ransack newspapers for incidences to be put to his books. In spite of these snide remarks, there is no denying the contemporary weaved in the novel adds to the rich texture of the work of our discussion. Referring to the quote on the brewing that we had mentioned earlier in our discussion of chapter 22, in this given light, it is important to state the wholesale trade was finally considered gentle in the second half of the 19th century, as it is the case with the proud, haughty Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham, she was a brewery heiress who fancies herself as an aristocrat. Pip begins with the iron chains at Joe's forge, but yearns for golden chains, those which also bind Miss Havisham to her past and her thirst for vengeance. At the close of chapter 19, Pip changes clothes, an act of symbol that he has also changed class, and leaves his two friends, Biddy and Joe, for the vain and superficial society of London. Like Martel Chuzzlewit in 1843, another picaresque novel, Pip leaves the unspoiled countryside for a city full of filth, crime, and oppression. However, Pip becomes a gentleman only in the true sense when he learns from the mouth of his benefactor the actual source of his great expectations. He proves his fundamental humanity by deciding to assist Magwitch, his great-hearted fairy godfather, who is to Pip what Miss Havisham is to Estella. Abel Magwitch, the victim of aristocrat and depraved compassion, is Dickens's indictment of the 19th century British society callous disregard for the welfare of the lower orders. From him, Pip unlearns the lessons of Miss Havisham, Jaggers, and Wemmick. Once again, he values people for what they are rather than for their portable property and pocketbooks. The central pot, with its secrets that Magwitch is responsible for Pip's fortune and that he is Estella's father, is obscured by surprisingly few digressions. The book's action is tight and well knit, owing in part perhaps to its weekly as opposed to Dickens's usually monthly serialized structure. Like its weekly serialized Britain, Hard Times, and A Tale of Two Cities, this 1861 novel has fewer characters and little subplotting. Expectations and exploitations are its organizing and unifying motives, and both work to build the larger frame of the novel, The True Gentleman. So this is, the idea of the gentleman that I'm talking about. The quotes will help you to understand what was the idea of a gentleman according to the contemporary society. This is the Newgate prison, the original pictures. This was at the center of London. So this was also the sign of its corruption. This is where Pip first lands up when he comes to London. This is ironical because he later learns that this place will have a deep connection with his life. These are some of the later pictures of Miss Havisham, the aristocrat who still wears her wedding dress, lives on that revenge, brings up Estella, or desires to bring Estella in such a fashion so that she's never betrayed by a man as she had been by Compassion. So it is her great expectation that Estella is never betrayed by another man. We have dealt with the question largely here, when does Pip become a gentleman? We have seen how he becomes. In the novel, Dickens shows how from infancy the individual is oppressed, molded, and channeled into the adult identity. The child is the father of man. Satie's house and London are a complementary microcosm and macrocosm. Dickens's symbols generally and of the world as prison metaphor in particular involve mud, dust, gardens, seeds, the courts, and the rivers. He contrasts the purity of the Thames in the marsh country at its mouth with its pollution and corruption in the metropolis. Dickens's ability to build suspense through adapting the devices of the late 18th century Gothic novel, the airy setting, the child or the young woman in danger, the evil and deformed monster, the plosive and the villainous aristocrat, the nightmare, and so on, has served as a model for later novelists. Dickens uses the persecution and exploitation of children and theatrically of funerals to build pathos in this novel. Apart from the direct influence of the life around, Dickens also used episodes reported in the newspaper or elsewhere. We had said that. One of the odd striking characters of the novel, Miss Havisham, whose expectations we have talked about, is once again a composite character. The street recluse in the Annual Register of 1778 that was etched in his memory because of a play that was performed only once in 1831, in which two characters, Rouge et Noire and the White Woman, were suggestive of demented women who were actually living at that time. Secondly, there was news of a jilted bride who, entirely dressed in white, would parade in Barn Street, and this was described by Dickens in an essay in Household Words. But the fragment of London lore and life that would have most immediately recalled the character of Miss Havisham to the readers of Great Expectation is the legend of Dirty Dick, the son of a well-to-do of a hardened street ironmonger whose engagement feast was abruptly cancelled by his intended death. He then sealed the undisturbed dining room that had been set for the banquet. Unlike Miss Havisham, he did not immune himself but became a wanderer till he died some 50 years later. There is another possibility that the character was inspired what appeared in January 1850 in the issue of Household Narrative Supplement to Household Words, where there was the mention of a Miss Havisham-like character, an eccentric called Martha Joachim of York Buildings, Strandford. There is no denying that newspaper bonded readers, and by the time Dickens, the readers had become a substantial number rather than a select few, and were provided with common sense of information, a shared vocabulary, centering on tropicalities that novelists among other writers would rely, or as they chose their allusion. Such borrowings could actually help them to choose topics of modernity, and that helped them to cater to the needs of the readers for whom they were writing for. This novel was published in 3 volumes later and was dedicated to Chaucery Hare Townshend, and the advertisement for the novel went thus: 3 volumes, post, 8 VO. This was something that had never been done by Dickens earlier, and none of his earlier works were ever issued in this form or pattern. The reviewers hailed it as a welcome return to the earlier manner of writing after passing under the cloud of Little Dorrit and Bleak House. So this was, a work that was bringing back Dickens to the mainstream again, after what many said that his other works had not done fairly well. This is supposed to be structurally a tragi-comic novel. So there is an experience. The narrative voice sometimes gets a little exaggerating, as we see in the case of Miss Havisham. It is the ending that has always, raised a question as far as this novel is concerned. Great Expectation has been noted for its economic style of writing, but a discussion on the text is incomplete if you do not talk about the ending. There is the original ending, where Pip and Estella do not get married. Pip does return to the village with the intention of marrying Biddy. He meets Estella on the way, learns that she is now happily married to a doctor. Her marriage with Drummle had a disastrous past. As we know, Drummle has died. Estella is free and happy. In the second ending, that was written because the people or the public did not like this kind of an ending. This time, before he returns to the city, Pip decides for one last time to go to the Satis house, where he finds Estella. Her disastrous marriage with Drummle had humbled her. She has now become a far gentler human being, and she is completely ready for Pip. And as they walk the pathway of the Satis house, you're given the feeling that they are going to get married and settle down. But what is interesting in both the endings, that Pip, in spite of his experience in London, does not for once think about returning to his roots or the village and settling down there. He's a true gentleman because, along with Herbert, he's now not looking for a benefactor, but he says that he's going to build his own life. He's going to face the challenges that London is going to provide. And we know that Dickens is a London novelist. He's somebody who knows the canvas of London like the back of his palm. And this is reflected in the ending. Dickens and his readers had confidence that, being the entertainer, he would not let the novel end on the darker note which he had done earlier. David Lodge had favored the first ending to the second and speaks thus, I quote, Estella was, after all, the sexual symbol of all the false hope on which Pip based his early life, and to reward him with the renunciation of these values with marriage to her is a kind of contradiction. It also compromises the novel's sober recognition that not all the damage that we do to ourselves and to others is repairable. In the original version, Pip, having realized belatedly that Estella is incapable of love, turns too late to the loving Biddy, and twice disappointed, accepts his single, childless state as, in a sense, his lust deserts him. Hence the irony in the cancelled conclusion of Estella's assumption that little Pip as his own child. So this was, what David Lodge had to say about the first ending. On the other side is David Lean's film, Great Expectations, that came out in 1946, that justifies the happy ending by having Pip save Estella, who had been jilted by Drummle, in the rewritten script from becoming another Miss Havisham. Paul Hemus developed his argument by concentrating on Pip's symbolic rape of Miss Havisham, finding in the tension and energy latent in the 19th century drive to reconcile the desire and the prohibition against incest without diminishing the power of either. There have been studies that have shown how David Copperfield's suppression of death and sex results in the formulation of his doubles as in Heap, etc. To add to this is an interesting fact. Dickens prepared a reading version of Great Expectations before the end of summer 1861. It was printed privately but never performed. In it remained young Pip's encounter with Magwitch in the churchyard and the other minor characters. Estella and Biddy are never mentioned. It does remain a question whether Dickens himself did feel that Estella episode was not that important in the growth of the character of Philip Pip. So this is something that remains with us even as we talk about the Great Expectations of Pip. These are the references that you can look into. The Great Expectation as a title then, of course, is justified because of the expectations that Pip had. There is the expectation of Miss Havisham. There is also, in a way, the expectation of Pip's elder sister, who also wants to use her brother so that she can climb up the social ladder. All these make up the Great Expectations. The references for you and the questions that can come is, of course, the justification of the title and, of course, whose Great Expectations is it?